Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something I think we can all relate to.
Okay.
Social comparison.
Yeah,
You know,
for sure.
that feeling you get when you're kind of sizing yourself up against other people.
Right.
Whether we're conscious of it or not,
Yeah.
it's happening all the time.
Yeah.
But it turns out, this isn't just some random human quirk.
Uh-huh.
It's actually like a deeply ingrained psychological process.
Yeah.
We're going to really unpack this today.
Cool.
Why we compare, who we compare to, and how it impacts us in ways we might not even realize.
I love it.
And lucky for us, we've got a stack of fascinating research on social comparison theory to guide our exploration.
What's really fascinating about social comparison is that it stems from this fundamental human need to understand ourselves.
Okay.
It's like we have this built-in drive to figure out where we stand in the world,
Yeah.
especially in areas where there isn't a clear-cut measuring stick.
Right.
Think about it. How do you know if you're a good writer or a truly generous person?
There isn't always a simple test for that.
Yeah, that's true.
So our brains naturally turn to others as a reference point.
Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
But I can see how this could get messy.
Sure.
I mean, if I'm comparing myself to, say, a professional athlete,
Mm-hmm.
isn't that just setting myself up for a major confidence crash?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why social comparison is so complex and intriguing. Back in 1954, a psychologist named Leon Festinger
Okay.
proposed his social comparison theory. And it's really the foundation for a lot of the research we'll be discussing today.
Okay.
His initial focus was on this idea of accuracy. We compare ourselves to others to get a more accurate sense of our own abilities and opinions, like a reality check, right?
Right. Like a way to gauge where we stand.
Exactly.
But hold on. Didn't you say earlier that we don't always have objective ways to measure ourselves?
Right.
If that's the case, how can we even know if our comparisons are accurate?
You've hit on a key point.
And that's where things get really interesting. Research has shown that people engage in social comparison even when objective measures do exist.
Wow.
And sometimes the impact of comparing ourselves to others can actually be more powerful than actual objective feedback. It's like our brains are wired to give more weight to social information.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
It's like our social world has this hidden power over us. So if it's not always about accuracy, what else is driving these comparisons? Why are we so compelled to size ourselves up against others?
Well, researchers have identified a few other key motives.
Okay.
And sometimes these motives can even be in conflict with each other.
Okay.
Sometimes we compare downwards, looking at people we perceive as worse off, and this is often about self-enhancement, a way to give our egos a little boost.
Right.
There's a classic study on breast cancer patients where a huge majority reported comparing themselves to those less fortunate.
Yeah.
It seemed to provide them a sense of comfort and perspective in a very difficult situation.
Yeah, I can see how that would be helpful in a tough situation.
Right.
It's like finding a silver lining.
Exactly.
But what about when we compare upwards
Mm-hmm.
to people who seem to be doing better than us?
Right.
It seems like that would just lead to disappointment or even envy. Is there a way to do upward comparisons without feeling terrible?
That's the thing. Upward comparisons aren't always bad.
Okay.
They can actually be really powerful for self-improvement.
Okay.
Think about role models. We look up to them, learn from them, and use their example to push ourselves further. In fact, in that same study with cancer patients, many also expressed a desire to interact with those who were slightly better off.
Oh,
They
interesting.
were looking for hope and inspiration.
So it's like, depending on our needs at the moment,
Yeah.
we adjust our comparison targets.
Yeah.
It's almost like choosing a filter on social media, except it's happening in our minds.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it highlights another important motive: efficiency. Social comparison can actually be a really efficient mental shortcut. It helps us quickly process information and figure out what's relevant. If you're trying to assess your own athletic ability, comparing yourself to others helps you quickly narrow down which skills are important to focus on.
Okay, so we've got these different motives swirling around in our heads,
Yeah.
all pushing us to compare ourselves to different
Mhm.
people.
Right.
But how do we actually choose WHO to compare ourselves to?
Right.
I mean, there are billions of people on this planet. How does our brain even begin to narrow it down?
Well, back to Festinger.
Okay.
He had a theory about that too. He called it the similarity hypothesis.
Okay.
Essentially, when we're looking for accurate self-evaluation, we tend to gravitate towards people who are similar to us. Makes sense, right?
Yeah.
Comparing yourself to someone completely different wouldn't give you a very useful gauge.
Yeah, if I'm comparing my chess skills to a grandmaster,
Right.
it's not going to tell me much about my own abilities. It's like comparing apples to oranges. But wait, didn't you say earlier that accuracy isn't always the goal?
You're exactly right, and that's where the complexity of social comparison really shines.
Okay.
Our choices of comparison targets are influenced by a blend of motives.
Okay.
We might seek out similar others for self-evaluation, but we also might be drawn to downward comparisons for a quick ego boost, especially when we're feeling a bit insecure. And let's not forget the allure of upward comparisons, those inspiring figures who motivate us to reach higher.
It's like this constant push and pull between these different motives,
Yeah.
all vying for control over who we choose to compare ourselves to. Is there ever a clear winner? Or are we always caught in this tug of war?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
And there's some really interesting research that sheds light on this.
Okay.
You know how we talked about those cancer patients using both upward and downward comparisons?
Right.
Well, one study found that they weren't limited to just one motive. They actually shifted their comparisons based on their needs in the moment. Sometimes they wanted an accurate assessment, sometimes a boost to their ego, and sometimes a dose of inspiration. It's like we have this toolbox of comparison strategies, and we pull out different tools depending on the task at hand.
Wow, that's really insightful. So we're not just stuck in one comparison mode.
Right.
We're constantly adapting based on what we need in the moment. But this whole process still sounds pretty deliberate, like we're consciously choosing who to compare ourselves to.
Right.
Is that always the case?
That's what's so interesting about social comparison.
Yeah.
It can operate on multiple levels. Sometimes it's a very conscious, strategic choice.
Okay.
But other times it's happening automatically, even unconsciously. Think about walking into a crowded room.
Yeah.
You might instantly start comparing yourself to others based on how they look, how they're dressed, even how much fun they seem to be having. It's not always a calculated decision.
Okay, I'm starting to see how deeply ingrained this comparison tendency really is. It's like this underlying current shaping our perceptions without us even realizing it.
Right.
But here's another question I've been wrestling with.
Okay.
If we're not always being strategic, how do we explain those times when we compare ourselves to people who are totally irrelevant? Like, why would I compare my singing voice to, say, Adele?
Uh-huh.
That's just a recipe for self-destruction.
You've hit on a key concept. Routine comparisons. Remember how we talked about our brains being wired for efficiency?
Right?
Sometimes we fall back on comparisons with familiar people,
Okay.
even if they're not the most logical or helpful choice. It's like our brains are saying, hey, we know this person, let's just use them as a quick reference point, even if it's not totally accurate.
Right.
These routine comparisons are really fascinating because they highlight how much our brains value efficiency, even if it means sacrificing a bit of accuracy.
So even when it comes to social comparison, we're creatures of habit. We tend to stick with what's familiar, even if it's not always serving us well. Which reminds me, I've totally been guilty of this. I always compare my cooking to my friend, who's basically a professional chef.
Right?
It's a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of social comparison, its impact.
Okay.
These comparisons don't just provide information,
Yeah.
they actually shape how we feel,
Right.
how we behave, and even how we perform.
Hold on, we've got to unpack that more. It sounds like you're saying these comparisons aren't just playing out in our heads, they're actually having real-world consequences.
Absolutely. And
Right.
this is where things get even more interesting.
All right.
Because those consequences can be positive or negative depending on how we're comparing and who we're comparing to.
Sure.
And that's exactly what we'll explore next. So we've established that these comparisons aren't just passive thoughts floating around in our heads.
Right.
They have real-world effects on us. And these effects can go in a couple of different directions. Researchers call these assimilations, where we become more like the person we're comparing ourselves to,
Yeah.
and contrast, where we actually move further away.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So it's like social comparison can either pull us towards someone or push us away.
Yeah.
But what determines which direction we go in? What makes us shift closer or further from our comparison target?
That's where a model called the selective accessibility model comes in.
Okay.
It suggests that whether we assimilate or contrast depends on where we're focusing our attention.
Oh.
If we're highlighting the similarities between ourselves and the other person, we're more likely to be influenced by them and shift closer to assimilate.
Okay.
But if we're zeroing in on the differences, we might end up distancing ourselves or contrasting.
So if I'm focusing on how much I have in common with someone I admire,
Right.
I might start to adopt some of their habits or perspectives.
Exactly.
But if I'm fixated on how different we are, I might end up pushing them away, mentally or even physically.
You got it. And this model helps explain all sorts of fascinating outcomes from our emotional reactions to how motivated we feel.
I'm starting to see how all of this connects.
Yeah.
We've got these motives driving our comparison. We're choosing targets based on similarity,
Right.
or sometimes just out of habit,
Yeah.
and then the way we actually compare,
Yeah.
focusing on similarities or differences,
Right.
shapes how we react.
Exactly.
It's like this intricate dance playing out in our minds
Yeah.
and influencing our behavior.
It really is. And speaking of reactions, have you ever noticed how social comparisons can fuel some pretty intense emotions?
Oh, yeah.
Think about pride,
Yeah.
envy,
Mm-hmm.
or even Schadenfreude, that kind of guilty pleasure we get when someone else stumbles.
Right.
These emotions aren't just random. They're deeply tied to our sense of self and how we perceive ourselves in relation to others.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
When I see someone succeeding in an area that I value, a little twinge of envy can definitely creep in. But I also know that feeling can sometimes push me to work harder to try to close that gap.
Yeah.
So maybe envy isn't always a bad thing.
That's a really interesting point, and it gets to the heart of how complex these emotional responses can be.
Okay.
Envy, for example, can be a powerful motivator,
Right.
but it can also lead to some not so great behaviors.
So it's like envy is a double-edged sword.
Yeah.
It can either inspire us to improve or it can tempt us to tear others down.
Right.
But beyond just feelings, how does all of this impact our actions, our motivation, our goals?
There's a really interesting theory that addresses this directly. The self-evaluation maintenance theory.
Okay.
This theory focuses on what happens when we engage in those threatening upward comparisons, especially with people who are close to us.
Okay.
Imagine, for example, that your best friend achieves something amazing, something you've always dreamed of doing yourself.
Right.
How do you think you'd react?
Honestly, I'd probably have mixed feelings.
Sure.
I'd be happy for them, of course. But I'd also likely feel a pang of envy,
Yeah.
especially if it's something I've been struggling with.
That's a perfectly natural reaction.
Right.
But according to this theory, we often react defensively to those kinds of comparisons.
Okay.
Instead of celebrating their success, we might downplay its importance.
Wow.
We might even distance ourselves from that friend, or worse, try to undermine their achievements.
Really?
It's like we're trying to protect our egos from the blow of feeling inferior.
Wow. That's pretty intense.
Yeah.
So it's like this subconscious self-protection mechanism.
Right.
We're so threatened by the idea of someone close to us outshining us that we react in ways that might actually hurt the relationship.
Exactly. And these defensive reactions can play out in all sorts of subtle ways, often without us even realizing it's happening.
Wow.
It's a fascinating example of how social comparison can operate below the surface, shaping our behavior in ways we might not even be aware of.
This is all starting to feel a bit heavy. Social comparison is clearly a powerful force, but it seems like it can lead to some pretty negative outcomes. Envy, insecurity, even damaging our relationships.
Yeah.
Are there any upsides to all of this?
Yeah.
Can social comparison ever be a force for good?
That's a great question, and the answer is a resounding yes.
Okay.
Social comparison can absolutely be a powerful tool for positive change, both for individuals and even for society as a whole.
Interesting.
It really comes down to how we use it.
Okay.
And that's exactly what we'll dive into next.
Okay, so we've explored kind of the dark side of social comparison, the envy, the self-doubt, the potential for strained relationships.
Right.
But I'm really curious to hear more about the positive side you mentioned. How can something that often makes us feel so bad actually be a force for good?
It all comes down to awareness and intentionality.
Okay.
Once we understand how social comparison works, we can start to harness its power for positive change.
Okay.
One area where this is really evident is in the realm of pro-social behavior actions that benefit others or society as a whole.
Interesting. I wouldn't have guessed that. So you're saying that comparing ourselves to others can actually inspire us to be more generous, more helpful, more kind.
Exactly. There's some fascinating research on this.
Yeah.
For example, some studies have shown that when people are presented with information about how their energy consumption compares to their neighbors, those who discover they use more energy are often motivated to reduce their consumption.
Interesting.
It's like that upward comparison sparks a desire to align their behavior with a more sustainable norm.
That's a great example. It
Yeah.
makes me wonder, are there other ways social comparison is being used to promote positive change.
Absolutely. It's being explored in all sorts of areas, from health and fitness to charitable giving.
Okay.
For example, some fitness apps use social comparison features to encourage users to be more active.
Uh-huh.
By seeing how their steps or workout frequency compares to others in their network, they might be more motivated to step up their game.
So that like social comparison can tap into our competitive spirit,
Right.
but in a way that benefits everyone.
Exactly. And it's not just about competition.
Yeah.
It can also foster a sense of community and a shared goals.
Yep.
When we see others engaging in positive behaviors, it can normalize those actions and make them seem more attainable.
This is all starting to make so much sense. It's like we've been so focused on the downsides of social comparison that we've overlooked its potential for good.
It's understandable that the negative impacts of social comparison, especially in the age of social media, are very real and can be quite significant.
Right.
But it's important to remember that social comparison is a fundamental human process.
Right.
And like any tool, it can be used for good or for ill.
Yeah.
It all comes down to how we wield it.
Speaking of social media,
Yes.
it feels like that's where the comparison game is often the most intense.
Uh-huh.
Everywhere we look, we're bombarded with images of perfect lives, perfect bodies, perfect vacations. It's exhausting. How do we even begin to navigate that without feeling completely inadequate?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And it's something I think we all struggle with to some degree.
For sure.
But there are definitely things we can do to mitigate those negative impacts.
Okay.
Awareness is key, as we've been discussing.
Yeah.
Reminding ourselves that social media is a highlight reel, not a true reflection of reality, can help us maintain a more balanced perspective.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that everyone has struggles and challenges, even those who seem to have it all figured out.
Right.
It's like we're comparing our blooper reel to everyone else's carefully edited masterpiece.
Exactly. And beyond that awareness piece, there are more proactive things we can do.
Okay.
We can be more mindful of who we follow and what content we consume.
Right.
Are there certain accounts that consistently trigger feelings of envy or inadequacy?
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to unfollow those accounts, or at least limit our exposure to them.
Yeah.
We can also make a conscious effort to fill our feeds with content that inspires us, uplifts us, and makes us feel good.
Right.
It's about curating our social media experience to align with our values and our well-being.
I love that curating our social media experience.
Yeah.
It's like taking back control and creating a digital space that nourishes us rather than depletes us.
Exactly.
It sounds simple, but I can already feel how empowering that shift in perspective could be.
It's a small change with potentially big impact. And it speaks to a larger point. We have more agency than we realize when it comes to social comparison.
Okay.
We can choose who we compare ourselves to. We can shift our focus from differences to similarities, and we can reframe our comparisons in a way that promotes growth rather than self-doubt. It's all about becoming more conscious of those mental habits and making choices that support our well-being.
This whole conversation has been such an eye-opener. I feel like I'm starting to see social comparison in a completely different light.
Yeah.
It's not just this negative force we need to avoid.
Right.
It's this complex and fascinating part of the human experience that we can learn to understand and even leverage for good.
I'm so glad to hear that. It really is about shifting our perspective and realizing that social comparison is a tool that can be used in many different ways. The more we understand how it works, the more empowered we are to use it consciously and intentionally.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into social comparison.
Yeah.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to ponder.
Okay.
Knowing that social comparison can be both a source of inspiration and a trigger for self-doubt, how can you become more mindful of your own comparison habits and harness their power for positive change in your life? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone.